This line reference question is a little interesting because it mentions the whole passage, even though it tells us to look in a particular part of the passage, right? So it does say, how does the third paragraph function in the passage as a whole? And then all the answer choices, or most of them at least, reference the big picture ideas in the passage. And so if we're using the no reading strategy, which I advocate, we might think we have a problem, right? How do we answer this first question of this passage if we haven't read the passage? It seems like we need to. But I'm going to use this as a great example of how, if it is truly a main idea, it should be repeated. It should be nearby this place that we're being told to look. We should not need the entire passage to answer this question. Now, what we do need, though, is to make sure we follow the +1 sentence rule, okay? Whenever we have a line reference, we're supposed to read a sentence before and a sentence after. And so that includes when we have a paragraph that we're told to read. So right here, I've cut out everything else except the paragraph we're told to read and a sentence before it and a sentence after it, right? I want that context. What's going on as I transition into and out of this paragraph? So let's just take a look at it. Let's just also use some dumb summaries here, try to understand it in a very simple way. Okay, so leading in, it says, a century and a half after the invention of the internal combustion engine, private car ownership is still an anomaly. Seems like just a random fact. And yet, public transportation, in many minds, is the opposite of glamour. Okay, so public transportation is the opposite of glamour. A squalid last resort for those with too many impaired driving charges, too poor to afford insurance, or too decrepit to get behind the wheel of a car. In much of North America, they are right. Taking transit is a depressing experience. Anybody who has waited far too long on a street corner for the privilege of boarding a lurching, overcrowded bus or wrestled luggage onto subways and shuttles to get to the big city airport knows that transit on this continent tends to be underfunded, ill-maintained, and ill-planned. Wow. Given the opportunity, who wouldn't drive? Hopping in a car almost always gets you to your destination more quickly. All right, so very obvious here. Dumb summary of this paragraph is negative, right? Negative specifically about public transit, okay? He's very against it, or something's going on here, very negative about it. And yet, look at that next line here. It doesn't have to be like this, right? Done right, public transport can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper than the private automobile. So we have a clear shift between this paragraph and what's coming, okay? Now, I don't know what that shift means quite yet because, again, I haven't read the passage, and specifically for this question, I haven't read the answer choices, and the answer choices are going to guide me here. Remember, no matter how confusing the passage is, the answer choices are almost always going to be easier to understand, and they will tell us what to care about. So let's look at these here. So what is the function of this third paragraph? It acknowledges that a practice favored by the author of the passage has some limitations. So I would ask myself a few questions here. What is the practice that we're talking about? Well, the practice is taking public transportation, right? So, okay, that's definitely talked about in the paragraph and around it, right? So is it something that is favored by the author? Now, most of what we read was negative. But we can tell going into that next paragraph, the +1 sentence here at the end that's highlighted in green, we can tell that the author is going to take a different view. It doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be like this. It can be faster, more comfortable, and cheaper. And so presumably, the rest of this passage is going to explain that point of view. So, okay, it is favored probably by the author. And then, does it have some limitations? Well, yeah, I mean, that whole paragraph is negative, so limitations would be negative. Okay, so I wouldn't just pick this because there's a little bit here of just like placing a bet, right? I'm pretty sure that I understand what this paragraph is doing, and I am pretty sure I understand what the surrounding passage, which I haven't read, is probably going to say. But I really do want to look at these other answer choices and see maybe there's a better bet. And if I'm still not sure, I can always read more of the passage, right? That's the best part of the no reading strategy. We start with a small chunk of text, And if that's not enough, we can always read extra, but we usually don't have to. So let's see. Let's see what happens here. So this, I like this choice. Let's look at choice B. It illustrates with detail the arguments made in the first 2 paragraphs of the passage. So I purposely omitted those paragraphs. But the question would be, is it really going against, is it really arguing for the same thing as what came before it? Well, it doesn't seem that way. It starts off with an "and yet," and that's a very contrast-heavy phrase, right? It seems to be contrasting with whatever came before it. And so I don't think so. This seems to be probably wrong. It illustrates with detail the arguments made in the first 2 paragraphs of the passage. So it seems to be a contradiction. Again, I can look at those 2 paragraphs very quickly and see, but I'm pretty confident just on what I have here that that's not what's happening. C, it gives an overview of a problem that has not been sufficiently addressed by the experts mentioned in the passage. Well, look, maybe there are experts mentioned in other places, but this is a great example of why narrowing your focus to just a few lines really makes a difference. There are no experts mentioned here, not in the lines that we were told to read and not in the surrounding sentences. Experts, if they were a big deal, if they were a main idea, we would expect it to come up here, right? If the 3rd paragraph was about the experts, we would expect them to be mentioned. They are not mentioned. So really bad, okay? If B is kind of maybe, then C is very, very wrong, okay? D, it advocates for abandoning a practice for which the passage as a whole provides mostly favorable data. Well, that kind of parallels A a little bit, right? So favorable is the rest of the passage. We did seem to have that, right? So the author favors public transit in the rest of the passage. Here, he or she is maybe talking about it more negatively. But notice the difference between A and D in terms of the strength of the choice. What are they really saying, right? A is saying that there's some limitations to public transit. Okay, yeah, it's bad in certain ways. D is saying the author wants us to abandon public transit. Okay, that's very different. That's much further than choice A is saying. Choice A is saying there's some bad qualities to public transportation. Choice D is saying we should never, ever, ever take public transit again because it's so bad. We don't have evidence of that. In fact, the very existence of the next paragraph and that those sentences that come right after this suggest the opposite, that he's not going to say that we should abandon public transit, but that we should fix it and make it better. So that leaves me with A, which is what I liked at the get-go here. And like I said, if I'm not feeling super confident in that, if it feels like I'm doing too much kind of assuming, then we can always read more. The reason I wouldn't here is, well, we're on the clock, right? This is a timed test, and for many of you, the time really does matter, and so we need to look for opportunities to shave off a minute or two. And we can answer this question with 75, 80, 85% confidence with just reading like the bare minimum of what we're told and an extra sentence. That's going to be good enough most of the time, and you need to be comfortable with placing bets basically on answer choices that you're not 100% certain of, but your confidence is really high, right? 85% certainty is usually good enough to move on. And if you have more time, you can always go back to the question. Especially here, since this is the first one, we're going to read more of this passage. If it turns out that I'm wrong, that he doesn't favor public transit, I could easily revise this question. But I'm happy with my answer for now, and as it turns out, it is the right answer. So I would be happy with it, when I get my scores back as well.